For centuries, sailors have spoken of a creature so massive, so devastating, that entire fleets would vanish without trace. They called it the Kraken, a monster born from the depths of the ocean, a tentacled nightmare that dragged ships to their doom and devoured entire crews. Stories spread across taverns in every port, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Captains swore they had seen it. Crews spoke of its enormous arms, thick as masts, that could crush a wooden hull like kindling. The legend grew until the Kraken became synonymous with maritime terror itself, a creature that embodied every fear a sailor could harbor about the unknowable deep. But here is what history has overlooked. The Kraken was never a monster at all. What sailors witnessed, what they experienced, what they described in those dramatic accounts was something far more subtle, far more tragic, and far more real than any mythological beast. The truth about the Kraken is a story not of a creature, but of a natural phenomenon so extraordinary, so alien to human understanding, that witnesses could only process it through the lens of monstrosity. And in doing so, they created a legend that would outlast the truth by centuries. The story begins with the waters themselves. The coasts of Norway and Greenland, where the Kraken legends were born, are places of profound natural violence. These are not gentle seas. They are arenas of competing currents, of thermal boundaries, of pressure systems that seem to defy comprehension. Below the surface, where light cannot penetrate, the ocean moves in ways that surface dwellers could never fully understand. Giant squid inhabited these depths, not the 30-foot creatures of popular imagination, but real animals, creatures that could reach lengths of 40, 50, even 60 feet. They were not aggressive by nature. They were reclusive. They preferred the darkness. They hunted the fish that populated those cold waters, and they avoided human contact whenever possible. But the ocean, in its terrible complexity, sometimes forces even the most solitary creature toward the surface. Sickness could drive them upward. Disorientation from injury or parasitic infection could cause them to breach. Powerful upwelling currents could entangle them and drag them into shallower waters than they had ever ventured before. And when a creature that large, that powerful, that fundamentally alien to human experience appeared in the twilight waters where ships traveled, the human mind did what it has always done. It reached for the language of monsters. Consider what a sailor would witness. Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden ship in the darkness of early morning, when the water is rough and visibility is low. The ship rocks beneath your feet. Your crew is tense. And then the water itself seems to move in a way that defies natural explanation. An enormous shape rises from below. Not gradually, like a whale surfacing to breathe, but suddenly, as if the ocean floor itself is ascending. Tentacles break the surface, thick as tree trunks, covered in suckers the size of dinner plates. They do not attack. The creature is confused, injured perhaps, trying to escape back to the depths from which it came. But to the terrified sailors on that ship, what they are witnessing is an impossible thing, a creature emerging from their worst nightmares. The rational mind, confronted with something it cannot categorize, defaults to the most emotionally resonant framework available. And in the age of sail, that framework was one of monsters and demons. Sailors would return to port and tell their stories. And with each retelling, the ambiguity of the encounter hardened into certainty. The confusion became malevolence. The desperate thrashing of a disoriented animal became deliberate assault. The creature that had been dying, perhaps, became an unstoppable force of nature incarnate. What makes this tragedy deeper is that we now understand the plight of these animals. Giant squid live under extreme pressure in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. Their biology is adapted to that environment in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. When they surface, they are not hunting. They are not invading human waters. They are dying. They are lost. They are experiencing conditions that their bodies and brains are not equipped to process. The distress that caused their ascent, combined with the horrifying transition from crushing pressure to relative weightlessness, creates an animal in agony. The sailors who encountered these creatures were not lying when they spoke of terror and devastation. They were not fabricating their fear, but they were interpreting a tragedy through the distorted lens of their own limited understanding. What they saw was a creature that seemed alien, that seemed hostile, that seemed to embody the very chaos and danger of the sea itself. What they could not see, what they had no framework to understand, was that they were witnessing the final moments of an animal that was suffering beyond measure. The Kraken exists in the historical record not as a monster, but as a monument to the gap between what we observe and what we understand. Every account of the creature, every terrifying tale told in dimly lit taverns, is actually a testimony to something real and extraordinary that human perception transformed into legend. The sailors were not wrong about what they saw. They were only wrong about what it meant, and perhaps that is the true tragedy. The Kraken, in its death and confusion, became the most feared creature in maritime mythology. The animal itself, injured or dying, struggling to survive in an environment that had become hostile to its existence, became a monster in the stories of those who witnessed its suffering. We created a legend of terror around an encounter with another living being that was itself terrified, itself desperate, itself struggling against forces beyond its comprehension. The ocean depths remain largely unknown to us even today. We have better technology now. We have submarines and deep-sea cameras. We have sonar and satellite imagery. And yet the mystery persists. We now know that giant squid are real. We have documented their existence scientifically. But the Kraken of legend, that enormous tentacled horror that dragged entire ships to the bottom of the sea, exists nowhere but in the imagination. What we have instead is something more poignant. The real story of real animals encountering human civilization in moments of profound vulnerability. A story not of conquest, but of misunderstanding. Not of malevolence, but of suffering. Not of a monster, but of a tragedy that played out in the dark waters off distant coasts, witnessed by humans who could only describe it in the language of fear. The legend of the Kraken endures because it speaks to something true about us. Our need to transform the unknown into something knowable, to reframe chaos as intentional, to see monsters where there might only be confusion and pain. And in doing so, we created a legend that obscured a far more interesting truth. The real story of the Kraken is not about a creature that was monstrous. It is about creatures that were misunderstood, misinterpreted, and ultimately vilified for the crime of being different, of being from a world so far removed from our own that we could not comprehend their nature. The Kraken was never our enemy. It was simply an animal, lost in waters it did not belong in, experiencing suffering we could not fathom, and being transformed by human perception into something it never was. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic story of all.